They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in modern corporate America, I prefer serving it as an automated source code copyright audit at exactly 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, when you steal a software engineer's sweat to buy your second Porsche. You do not just break a promise, you pull the pin on a digital grenade buried beneath your own empire. Buckle up, because ruining them costs way more than expected. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so sincerely for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel monetization, leaving us without the necessary operating budget to keep bringing these experiences to you. If you find today's story compelling, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can hear exclusive, fully verified true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and packed with intricate details we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all performed with multiple highly emotional voice actors within a single narrative. You can become a member right now by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's corporate nightmare, where my name is Aurora Morris, and I learned exactly how little a promise means to a man in a tailored suit. I am 34 years old, and until very recently, I was the lead senior data engineer at Vanguard Nexus. If you drive an electric vehicle, chances are your battery passed through our Denver logistics hubs. Vanguard is a corporate giant, the kind of sprawling empire that prides itself on cutting-edge innovation while simultaneously nickel and diming the people who actually build its foundation. I was standing in one of our sterile, glass-walled conference rooms, staring blankly at a pathetic cluster of cheap metallic balloons. They were supposed to be celebrating the official, highly successful launch of the Apex Engine project. The Apex Engine was not just a piece of software, it was my life for the past 18 months. It was an artificial intelligence supply chain analysis system that I coded from scratch, fueled by endless cups of stale coffee and countless sleepless nights. It was a masterpiece of predictive logistics. In just its first quarter of deployment, my algorithm optimized shipping routes so flawlessly that it saved the company $40 million in transportation costs. $40 million in pure, unadulterated profit, materialized from the sheer force of my intellect and exhaustion. But in corporate America, the person who builds the machine rarely gets to hold the trophy. That privilege belonged to Bradley. Bradley was our vice president of innovation, a hollow title gifted to a man whose only real qualification was his uncle sitting on the board of directors. He was a textbook nepotism hire, completely devoid of technical skill, but heavily armed with slicked-back hair, expensive cologne, and a vocabulary entirely composed of meaningless corporate buzzwords. As the applause rippled through the room, Bradley stepped up to the podium. He walked over to me, slung a heavy, condescending arm over my shoulder, and pulled me tight against his side like a prized show dog. He flashed his perfectly bleached teeth at the crowd and declared to the entire company that the Apex Engine was a triumphant victory of management vision and strategic executive leadership. He spoke about synergies and top-down ideation, completely erasing the reality of me sitting alone in a dark cubicle writing thousands of lines of complex logic while he was out playing golf. I forced a stiff smile, playing the part of the grateful subordinate, because that is what you do when you are a white-collar worker trapped in the machine. Eventually, the forced cheerfulness faded. People drained their plastic cups of cheap champagne, and the crowd dispersed back to their desks. Before I could slip away, Bradley grabbed my elbow and pulled me into a quiet corner of the room. The charismatic executive persona vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk. He leaned in, lowering his voice so the passing interns would not hear. He told me that regarding the $150,000 performance bonus clearly outlined in my project contract, the finance department had just frozen the payout. He casually blamed it on a sudden budget restructuring initiative. He patted my arm and told me I had to understand, saying it was just business, nothing personal. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I just stood there, breathing evenly, staring directly into his face. I studied the slight crinkle at the corner of his eyes and the relaxed posture of his shoulders. In that split second, I saw right through the lie. That money was never frozen by finance. A $150,000 payout was a drop in the bucket compared to the $40 million I just saved them. I knew exactly how corporate accounting worked at Vanguard. My bonus had not disappeared. It had simply been quietly redirected, funneled straight into the massive year-end bonus pool for the executive board. Bradley and his friends were going to buy luxury sports cars using the money I bled for. I held his gaze for a moment longer, my expression perfectly smooth and devoid of any readable emotion. I gave him a small, polite nod, smiled softly, and said, "I understand." Bradley looked relieved, clearly thinking he had successfully managed a potential human resources problem. He turned and walked away, his expensive leather shoes clicking arrogantly against the hardwood floor. I turned and walked back to my desk. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and stared at my computer monitors. The screens had gone to sleep, their black surfaces reflecting my own emotionless face back at me. My eyes were dark, hollow, and completely devoid of the loyalty that had kept me working until dawn for this wretched company. Bradley thought he had won because he held the executive title and the corporate power. He thought I was just a quiet, obedient engineer who would swallow the injustice and keep writing code for his benefit. But he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game we were playing. A war in the digital age does not begin with a deafening roar or a dramatic confrontation in a boardroom. It begins in absolute silence, initiated by a single, deliberate click of a mouse. As I sat in that sterile, brightly lit cubicle, absorbing the reality of the theft that had just occurred, my mind methodically drifted back exactly 3 years, before I was ever trapped in this suffocating corporate hierarchy, before Vanguard Nexus slapped a restrictive corporate badge around my neck and tried to claim my brain as their property. I was a ghost in their machine. I was an independent contractor. What Bradley and his clueless executive board fundamentally failed to grasp was the true genesis of the system they were currently celebrating. The foundational architecture, the absolute beating heart of the predictive routing logic, was not birthed on Vanguard property. It was meticulously written on a battered laptop in my cramped apartment under the legal banner of my own private, independent company, AM Tech Limited Liability Company. Vanguard did not commission the core framework of the artificial intelligence. They were merely renting it. When the executives finally realized the absolute goldmine I had created, their aggressive legal team moved swiftly to bring me in-house. They offered me a lucrative full-time position, presenting a massive mountain of onboarding paperwork designed to strip away my autonomy and transfer all my intellectual property directly into their greedy hands. But corporate lawyers are often arrogant, and arrogance inevitably breeds laziness. They skimmed the documents I returned to them. They did not look closely at page 47, buried deep within the dense, mind-numbing legalese of Appendix C. Anticipating this exact scenario, I had hired a very hungry, highly meticulous contract lawyer to draft a highly sophisticated intellectual property licensing clause. It stipulated, in agonizingly clear, unbreakable terms, that Vanguard Nexus only retained the right to utilize the base source code as long as the creator's performance bonuses were paid in full within 30 days of the system officially going live. It was a beautiful, perfectly legal, and entirely lethal trapdoor. The clause explicitly dictated that in the event of a breach of contract regarding my compensation, the usage license would be automatically and irrevocably revoked. There would be no grace period. There would be no tedious arbitration process. The entire algorithm would instantly revert to a state of absolute encryption lock. Every single line of code, every predictive model, every logistical pathway that kept their trucks moving would become entirely inaccessible to Vanguard. Furthermore, sole, undisputed ownership would instantaneously revert back to AM Tech Limited Liability Company. The Vanguard lawyers had signed it without a second thought, blinding themselves with the promise of endless logistical dominance. I could have marched right into the Human Resources Department the moment Bradley delivered his smug little speech about budget cuts. I could have threatened them with a massive lawsuit, screaming about workplace injustice and blatant breach of contract. But a loud enemy is a predictable enemy, and predictable enemies are easily silenced or outspent by high-priced corporate defense attorneys. Instead, I chose the path of the phantom. I transformed my daily routine into a meticulous, silent audit. I began systematically and quietly archiving absolutely everything, every morning, before the office filled with the hum of superficial corporate chatter. I secured internal communications. I downloaded every email where Bradley or the executives acknowledged my sole authorship of the code. I pulled every financial projection and quarterly report. I built an impenetrable digital fortress of data proving, without a shadow of a legal doubt, that my system was currently carrying 90% of the entire company's freight revenue on its digital shoulders. If my system fell, their entire distribution network would bleed out in hours. Meanwhile, Bradley was eagerly busy digging his own grave with a silver spoon, drunk on the unearned praise from the executives and completely oblivious to the legal tripwire he was currently dancing upon. He began a systematic campaign of erasure. I watched in real time from my terminal as he accessed the shared network drives and started altering the official project documentation. He carefully deleted my name from the architectural overviews being prepared for the board of directors. He replaced my complex technical schematics with glossy, simplified presentation slides, boldly listing himself as the chief architect and visionary of the entire platform. He was not just stealing my money, he was actively attempting to steal my professional legacy, leaving an easily traceable, undeniable digital footprint of corporate fraud every single time he pressed save on a modified document. I let him do it. I watched his clumsy digital footprints and let him weave his fragile web of lies, because every lie was another solid nail in his impending coffin. I went home that evening, descended into my basement, and booted up my secure personal server. I opened the master control terminal for AM Tech Limited Liability Company and quietly initiated a digital countdown clock. 30 days. That was the exact legal window Vanguard Nexus had to pay my promised bonus before the automated kill switch armed itself and executed the contract. The very next morning, I walked back into the Vanguard building. I swiped my identification badge. I smiled warmly at the security guard. I brewed my morning cup of dark roast coffee in the break room, chatting amiably about the weekend weather with oblivious colleagues. I sat at my desk, typing away, flawlessly playing the role of the docile, tamed employee who had meekly accepted her unfair fate. They looked at me and thought they had successfully broken my spirit. They had absolutely no idea they were just watching the timer tick down on their own spectacular destruction. It was day 20 of the silent countdown, and the atmosphere in the office was thick with the suffocating arrogance of untouchable management. The tension coiled tightly in my chest, but externally, I remained a flawless portrait of focused dedication. That morning, the fragile peace of the engineering bay was shattered when Bradley swaggered through the double doors. He was not alone. Trailing closely behind him was a man who looked distinctly out of place among the glowing monitors and quiet hum of servers. Bradley loudly introduced the stranger to the floor as Marcus, describing him as an elite optimization consultant brought in by executive leadership to streamline our technical workflows. I did not need to trust my instincts. I trusted my data. A swift, covert background check executed on my secondary monitor revealed the pathetic truth in less than 2 minutes. Marcus was absolutely not an elite consultant. He was Bradley's old fraternity brother from their university days. His only notable contribution to the technology sector was a spectacularly failed startup venture from 5 years ago. Bradley cleared his throat, commanding my attention, and gestured for me to follow him. He pulled me into a soundproof glass office and aggressively twisted the blinds shut. He leaned heavily across the conference table, the overpowering scent of his expensive cologne completely masking the sterile smell of the room. "Aurora," he began, his voice dripping with forced corporate authority. "Management requires full cross-security compliance on this project moving forward. I need you to surrender root access and all administrative privileges of the system over to Marcus immediately." The play was so glaringly obvious, so utterly devoid of sophistication, that I found it genuinely insulting. Bradley wanted Marcus to clone the entire source code repository. His overarching master plan was crystal clear. He intended to steal the architecture, terminate my employment the absolute second the 30-day legal window closed, and permanently secure his claim over the software and every single financial bonus it would ever generate. However, if I handed over the digital keys without putting up a fight, a corporate snake like Bradley would immediately grow suspicious. I needed to play my part flawlessly to maintain the illusion of my subordination. I let my eyes widen in perfectly feigned panic. I crossed my arms defensively, shrinking back into my chair, and allowed my voice to tremble just enough to sound authentically threatened by his demand. "You cannot be serious, Bradley," I argued, injecting a sharp, desperate edge into my tone. "This is highly sensitive infrastructure. Handing over root access to an external contractor compromises the entire stability of the logistics network." I pushed back just long enough to stroke his massive ego, providing him the opportunity to flex his executive dominance. "This is not a negotiation," he snapped, his face flushing red with the intoxicating thrill of power. "Hand over the credentials, or we will have security escort you out of the building right now." I let my shoulders slump in simulated crushing defeat. I let out a heavy, resigned sigh, walked slowly back to my main terminal, and typed in the master override commands, formally transferring total root access to his profoundly incompetent friend. But what Bradley and his fraudulent consultant did not know was that I had spent the last 2 weeks meticulously weaving a very specific, lethal thread into the fabric of the code. I did not just hand Marcus the keys to the kingdom. I deliberately left an incredibly complex, deeply obfuscated backdoor wide open in the system architecture. This backdoor was not a standard security vulnerability. It was a direct, heavily encrypted umbilical cord, tied straight to the automated legal auditing servers, humming quietly in the basement of AM Tech Limited Liability Company. Marcus smugly took over my workstation, cracking his knuckles like a hacker in a cheap movie. I watched from the periphery as he began his clumsy digital excavation. The man coded with all the grace and precision of a sledgehammer. He began haphazardly rummaging through the most delicate, intricate layers of my neural network. His primary objective was immediately obvious. He was desperately hunting for the copyright headers and the creator tags, attempting to surgically alter the proprietary code lines to permanently scrub my existence from the digital framework. He wanted to rewrite history. However, Marcus completely lacked the fundamental intelligence required to comprehend the sheer complexity of the ecosystem he was vandalizing. He began brute forcing his way through the core logic gates, recklessly altering foundational variables without understanding their deep-rooted dependencies. I fully expected his chaotic, amateurish meddling to simply crash the localized testing environment. Instead, his aggressive, sloppy intrusion into the highly restricted proprietary directories triggered a reaction far more spectacular. His unauthorized attempts to overwrite the core intellectual property tags did not break the software. They registered as a hostile, malicious security breach. It bypassed the standard internal error logs completely and went straight to the ultimate defensive failsafes. Without realizing it, Marcus had just manually tripped the automated copyright audit protocol exactly 3 days earlier than my original countdown was scheduled to expire. I was sitting outside in the corporate courtyard on my lunch break, enjoying the crisp afternoon breeze, when the inevitable notification arrived. My phone vibrated violently against the wooden surface of the picnic table. I calmly glanced down at the screen. A single, blazing red alert notification pulsed on the display, sent directly from my private home server. The breach had been confirmed. The automated protocol was executing its lethal directives. I did not panic. I did not rush back upstairs to warn them or save the network. I methodically finished the last bite of my sandwich, stood up, and smoothed the invisible wrinkles from my skirt. I walked steadily toward the grand front entrance of the massive glass building, unclipped my plastic corporate identification badge from my collar, and tossed it effortlessly into the nearest metal trash receptacle. It landed with a hollow, satisfying clatter. I walked straight to the parking lot, got into my car, and drove away without ever looking in the rearview mirror. As soon as I pulled into the quiet sanctuary of my driveway, I powered down my personal cell phone, completely severing my connection to the outside world. I walked into my kitchen, approached the wine rack, selected a very expensive, perfectly chilled bottle of Chardonnay, and reached for the corkscrew. The digital hurricane was about to make landfall, and I possessed the absolute best seat in the house. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the artificial heartbeat of Vanguard Nexus flatlined. Inside the massive, high-tech Central Operations Center, dozens of massive wall-to-wall monitoring screens continuously displayed a beautifully synchronized, constantly updating ballet of global logistics. Blinking digital dots, representing thousands of active shipments, moved seamlessly across brightly illuminated topological maps of the continent. The room was always filled with the low, confident hum of servers and the quiet chatter of dispatchers managing the endless flow of commerce. Then, without a single warning klaxon, without a solitary error chime, every single screen in the cavernous facility flickered violently. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the vibrant maps vanished, replaced instantly by an absolute, pitch-black void. The bustling noise of the command center died down to a terrified, breathless hush. A moment later, a single line of glaring, blood-red text materialized in the dead center of every single monitor, casting a sinister crimson glow across the pale, shocked faces of the logistics team. The message was brutally concise, demanding absolute attention. It read, "Intellectual property copyright violation. Access denied by AM Tech Limited Liability Company." The digital blackout was not just a localized visual glitch contained within the walls of the corporate headquarters. It was a physical, sprawling paralysis that struck the nation's supply chain instantly. Out on the sun-baked highways, stretching from the arid deserts of Nevada to the crowded, congested interstates of New York, the real-world consequences hit like a massive concrete wall. Hundreds of massive 18-wheeler trucks, currently hauling highly sensitive, temperature-controlled electric vehicle batteries, were suddenly and violently stranded. They were forcibly halted at statewide stations and federal security checkpoints across the entire United States because their automated clearance protocols and digital manifests simply ceased to exist. Even worse, the remote telemetry systems controlling the heavy-duty refrigerated trailers were completely severed from the main corporate network. Without the constant, micro-adjusted stream of data from my algorithm, the deep freeze cooling units defaulted to an emergency safety shutdown to prevent spontaneous electrical fires. The financial hemorrhage was instantaneous, absolute, and catastrophic. The senior logistics analysts, abandoning their useless terminals and using their manual backup calculators, quickly estimated that the company was bleeding a staggering $500,000 every single hour those trucks sat baking in the relentless afternoon sun. Back in the suffocating, soundproof glass office, the so-called elite optimization consultant was experiencing a profound, sweat-drenched descent into total panic. Marcus hammered his thick, trembling fingers against the mechanical keyboard with frantic, uncoordinated desperation. He was desperately trying to hit the undo sequence, wildly attempting to roll back his clumsy, forceful intrusion. But the automated system had completely and utterly isolated him. Every single override command he frantically typed into the master terminal was instantly and aggressively rejected. Instead of executing his corrective code, the command line brutally spat back a lengthy, impenetrable legal citation ripped directly from page 47 of Appendix C of my employment agreement. The screen mocked him with perfectly formatted, legally binding contractual jargon regarding unauthorized source code appropriation and intellectual property theft. His breathing grew incredibly shallow and ragged, echoing loudly in the small room. The horrifying, undeniable realization finally crashed heavily down upon his shoulders. He had not optimized a single thing. By aggressively trying to steal my life's work, he had officially and irreversibly lock down his best friend's entire billion-dollar multinational corporation. Outside the glass enclosure, Bradley had completely lost the polished, arrogant, untouchable executive veneer he had worn so proudly just hours before. His face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of deep purple as he paced frantically across the engineering floor, screaming into his mobile phone so loudly that the veins in his thick neck threatened to burst under the pressure. He was ruthlessly mobilizing every single internal information technology engineer on the payroll, threatening them with immediate termination and demanding an instantaneous network rollback. Dozens of frantic, terrified technicians scrambled into the freezing server rooms, desperately plugging diagnostic cables into the blinking mainframe racks, but their desperate efforts were entirely futile. The senior network administrators quickly realized, with sinking dread, that they were not fighting a standard software bug, a conventional malicious virus, or an external hacker. They were ramming their collective heads against a mathematically perfect, military-grade encrypted legal firewall. The complex encryption keys locking the database were generated using dynamic algorithmic hashes tied directly to the exact millisecond of the contract breach. No one inside that building, no matter their title or salary, possessed the necessary security authorization or the sheer brute force computing power required to break the cipher. They were completely, pathetically locked out of their own house. While the engineers were drowning in an ocean of encrypted chaos, the final, most devastating phase of my automated protocol silently executed itself in the background. Operating entirely independently of the lockdown main internal servers, a ghost script woke up and initiated a pre-programmed mass communication sequence. It drafted a highly classified, legally binding notification and seamlessly bypassed every internal corporate spam filter. With ruthless, undeniable efficiency, it broadcasted this message simultaneously to the personal and professional electronic inboxes of the entire executive board of directors and the top 10 largest corporate shareholders. The subject line was designed to be impossible to ignore. The body of the email clearly and coldly stated, "Employment contract violation confirmed. Algorithm usage license officially revoked due to unauthorized source code appropriation and internal corporate theft." The silent digital guillotine had successfully dropped, instantly exposing Bradley's financial corruption, his blatant lies, and his catastrophic mismanagement to the exact people who held his entire career and freedom in the palms of their hands. While Vanguard Nexus rapidly descended into a raging, uncontrollable inferno of unprecedented corporate panic and financial ruin, the atmosphere inside my sunlit living room was the absolute picture of serene tranquility. I had gladly changed out of my stiff, restrictive corporate attire and slipped into my most comfortable, soft cotton yoga clothes. I stretched my arms high above my head, feeling the satisfying physical pop of tension permanently leaving my shoulders. I walked slowly over to the marble kitchen island, picked up my heavy crystal glass, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the perfectly chilled Chardonnay. The crisp, fruity notes danced flawlessly on my tongue. I carried my glass over to the plush living room sofa, flipped open my personal tablet, and initiated a highly secure, encrypted video call. The screen blinked twice, revealing the sharp, fiercely focused face of my ruthless intellectual property attorney sitting comfortably in his high-rise downtown office. I offered him a calm, genuinely radiant, and deeply satisfied smile. I took another small, deliberate sip of my wine, looked directly into the high-definition camera, and gave him the final, irrevocable authorization. "Begin," I instructed him, my voice smooth, confident, and perfectly steady. "Send them to hell." I was miles away, safely insulated in the quiet comfort of my home, but the catastrophic events unfolding back at the Vanguard Nexus headquarters were later relayed to me in exquisite, deeply satisfying detail by my legal team. The entire sequence of events played out exactly like a classic tragedy, perfectly scripted by my algorithm's execution protocols. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the Executive Board of Directors convened a mandatory emergency crisis meeting in the penthouse boardroom, The atmosphere inside that room was incredibly suffocating, practically choking the executives with a thick, undeniable stench of pure, unadulterated corporate panic. The chief executive officer, a seasoned corporate veteran usually known for his icy, untouchable composure in the face of market crashes, completely lost his grip on reality. He stood rigidly at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table, his eyes locked onto a giant digital display screen mounted on the far wall. The screen was actively tracking the real-time financial hemorrhage caused by the paralyzed supply chain. When the glowing red digits aggressively ticked past the $3 million mark in sustained logistical damages, something inside him simply snapped. He let out a primal, guttural roar of absolute fury, grabbed his heavy crystal water glass, and hurled it directly at the expensive hardwood paneling. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, the sharp, violent crash instantly silencing the frantic, terrified whispers of the panicked executives gathered around him. Sitting halfway down the long table was Eleanor. She was the general counsel and the supreme head of the corporate legal department. Eleanor was a razor-sharp, terrifyingly intelligent woman who absolutely did not suffer fools, and she had spent the last 6 agonizing hours meticulously dissecting the monumental legal nightmare that had suddenly swallowed their entire empire whole. While the rest of the board of directors was busy hyperventilating and pointing fingers, she remained perfectly composed, radiating an aura of lethal calm. Resting on the table directly in front of her was a very thick, heavily tabbed manila folder. Written across the front cover in bold, unforgiving black marker was the title: Aurora Morris Employment Contract. Without uttering a single preliminary word to announce her intentions, Eleanor stood up. She locked her piercing, merciless gaze entirely onto Bradley, picking up the massive file with one hand. With a sudden, shocking burst of physical force, she violently hurled the heavy folder entirely across the length of the table. It slid aggressively across the polished wood, launching into the air and smacking forcefully into Bradley's chest, knocking the breath completely out of his lungs and scattering legally binding documents all over his lap. "You absolute, unmitigated disaster of a human being," Eleanor began, her voice dripping with a venomous, surgical precision that cut through the stifling room like a sharpened scalpel. She did not yell, because true power never needs to raise its volume. The sheer, freezing authority embedded in her tone demanded total, unconditional obedience. Not only did you maliciously steal her promised $150,000 performance bonus to illegally cover up the massive, embarrassing shortfalls in your own executive slush fund, but you also possess the breathtaking, staggering stupidity to let a complete, unvetted amateur tamper with intellectual property that fundamentally does not belong to us. We are not experiencing a random system malfunction, Bradley. We are currently actively engaged in massive corporate software theft, and the brilliant creator of that software just caught us absolutely red-handed. Bradley looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. His heavily gelled hair, usually his pride and joy, was now wildly disheveled. His face was glistening with a thick, greasy layer of panicked sweat, and he desperately tried to mount a pathetic defense. He stammered incoherently, frantically waving his trembling hands in a sickening display of feigned innocence. "That is totally insane," he finally choked out, his voice cracking violently under the immense, crushing pressure of the room. "She did this on purpose. Aurora deliberately and maliciously sabotaged the central logistics mainframe because she was disgruntled about the budget cuts. This is a targeted cyber attack. This is textbook corporate extortion. We need to immediately contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to have federal agents sent to her house to arrest her right now before she completely destroys our entire infrastructure." He was desperately grasping at imaginary straws, foolishly hoping his executive title and his family connections would magically shield him from the undeniable, impending truth. But Eleanor was 10 steps ahead, having already anticipated his cowardly, predictable deflection, with a cold, triumphant smirk that sent shivers down the spines of the other board members. She reached into the pocket of her tailored designer blazer, pulled out her personal cell phone, and placed it perfectly in the dead center of the mahogany table. She deliberately tapped the speakerphone button. The terrified, trembling voice of the internal network security director echoed loudly through the completely silent boardroom. "We just finished a comprehensive, deep forensic audit of the localized terminal access logs," the security director reported, his voice shaking so badly he could barely string the sentence together. The individual who manually triggered the military-grade encryption lock was absolutely not Aurora Morris. The hostile intrusion originated entirely from the temporary, highly restricted guest account assigned specifically to Marcus. The internal security protocols explicitly recorded his exact keystrokes. He was actively attempting to breach the core restricted repository, maliciously strip the embedded copyright headers, and illegally clone the entire predictive algorithm, presumably to package and secretly sell it to one of our largest competitors. The silence that immediately followed that revelation was absolute, incredibly heavy, and completely suffocating. Every single pair of furious, predatory eyes in that luxurious room slowly turned and locked directly onto Bradley's sweating face. The arrogant, untouchable hunter, the man who had so confidently and obnoxiously paraded through the engineering department just hours prior, had instantly transformed into cornered, helpless prey, his face completely drained of all remaining color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of chalky white. His legs gave out beneath him, his knees buckling as he collapsed heavily back into his expensive ergonomic leather chair. The horrifying reality of his situation crashed down upon his shoulders with the unstoppable weight of a collapsing skyscraper. His lucrative corporate career, built entirely on lies and stolen credit, was not just completely over. It was reduced to radioactive, unsalvageable ash, even more horrifyingly, the very real. Chilling specter of federal prison time was now staring him directly in the face, opening its jaws, patiently waiting to devour his entire life. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the pristine silence of my suburban neighborhood was abruptly broken by the heavy crunch of tires on gravel. A massive, entirely black executive sport utility vehicle aggressively mounted the curb and parked half on the asphalt and half on my meticulously manicured front lawn. From my kitchen window, I watched as the chief executive officer and Eleanor stepped out into the morning dew. They did not arrive flanked by aggressive corporate security guards or a legion of threatening litigation attorneys. Their shoulders were slumped, their posture was defeated, and their faces were drawn tight with absolute exhaustion. They had not come to my home to issue threats. They had come to beg. I casually unlocked the front door and silently gestured for them to enter my living room. I was entirely done playing the role of the polished, obedient subordinate. I had completely shed my stifling corporate wardrobe, opting instead for a faded, comfortable cotton t-shirt and loose sweatpants. I sat comfortably on my plush sofa, crossing my legs underneath me, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm and total control. Sitting directly in the center of my glass coffee table was a single, freshly printed legal folder. The chief executive officer refused to sit down. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking entirely out of place in my home, clutching his hands together tightly in a desperate attempt to stop them from visibly trembling. "Aurora," he began, his voice hoarse and completely devoid of its usual booming corporate authority. "We are prepared to completely rectify this unfortunate misunderstanding immediately. I have authorized the immediate direct transfer of your original $150,000 performance bonus. Furthermore, as a gesture of our extreme goodwill and to adequately compensate you for the emotional distress caused by Bradley's entirely unauthorized actions, I am personally offering an additional $100,000 apology fee, $250,000, entirely tax-free, wired to your private account the very second you remove the encryption lock and restore the logistics network." I looked up at him, letting a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us for several long seconds. Then, I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed coldly in the quiet room. "You are fundamentally mistaken," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. I am absolutely not asking for that bonus anymore. The time for that specific transaction expired yesterday. The contract you authorized and signed is explicitly clear. A financial violation means Vanguard Nexus instantaneously loses every single right to utilize the Apex engine, permanently and irrevocably. I leaned forward, picked up the new manila folder from the glass table, and slid it smoothly toward the edge closest to him. As of right now, that entire software architecture belongs solely to my private corporation. Your access license is dead. However, if you would like your frozen supply chain to start moving again before your board of directors forcefully removes you from your position, Vanguard Nexus will have to formally lease the logistics software back from me. The new licensing fee is exactly $15 million per year, and I require the entire first year paid entirely upfront, today. The chief executive officer's face turned a horrifying, mottled shade of deep purple. He opened his mouth to argue, to scream, to desperately negotiate, but Eleanor placed a firm, silencing hand on his tailored sleeve. She gave him a grim, defeated nod, silently confirming that my legal trap was absolutely impenetrable. He knew he had zero leverage and absolutely no other viable options. With a heavy, ragged sigh that sounded like a man surrendering his soul, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his expensive fountain pen, and signed his name on the dotted line, his hand trembling so violently that the dark ink smeared slightly across the heavy paper. I calmly retrieved the signed document, checking the signature for legal accuracy. I offered him one final, icy smirk and whispered my ultimate condition. Oh, and there is one more minor detail. I expect to receive the high-definition security camera footage showing Bradley being forcefully escorted out of the building by armed guards, carrying his personal belongings in a cardboard box, before 12 o'clock noon today. Make sure the audio feed is perfectly clear. By noon that exact day, the national logistics system roared back to life. The massive fleet of trucks rolling freely under my newly leased algorithm. Simultaneously, my personal phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I had two new notifications. The first was a massive, life-altering direct deposit confirmation from my bank for $15 million. The second was an attached video file sent directly from Eleanor. I pressed play, listening to the deeply satisfying sound of Bradley sobbing and desperately pleading as two massive security guards marched him out of the glass lobby and onto the unforgiving concrete pavement. I smiled, closed my laptop, and leaned back in my chair. Finally, my hard work was truly rewarded. It was complete, absolute, and perfectly fair. Thank you so sincerely for taking the time to listen to my story today. Where is everyone tuning in from right now? I would absolutely love to read your locations down in the comments. If you felt that today's journey was compelling and you want to help support our work, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. That is where you can listen to our absolute best, highly exclusive, verified true stories that are simply too intense and detailed to publish publicly on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code right there on your screen, or you can simply use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment below.